There is a small cylinder of pink granite sitting in a glass case in a museum in London, and the marks carved into its surface should not exist. Not because they are beautiful, because they are too fast. A groove spirals around that core, cut so cleanly and so deep with each turn that when a modern engineer measured it, the number he got back described a cutting speed that our own diamond drills cannot match today. That core was pulled out of the ground beside the Great Pyramid, and the tool that made it has never been found. No blade, no bit, no machine. Just the hole it left behind, and a spiral of evidence that someone 4,500 years ago was cutting through one of the hardest stones on Earth as if it were soft wood. The official story is that they did it with copper and sand and endless patience. But the stone itself tells a different story, and once you see what is actually recorded in it, the polite explanation starts to fall apart in your hands. This is the mystery almost no tour guide mentions when you stand in front of a granite statue in Egypt. You are told the Egyptians were master craftsmen, and they were. You are told they worked slowly and carefully with simple tools, and sometimes they did. But there is a category of object scattered across Egypt that does not fit that story at all. Objects cut with a precision that reads less like handwork and more like manufacturing. And the deeper you follow the marks, the tool marks, the drill grooves, the impossibly flat inner walls, the closer you get to a question mainstream archaeology has never fully answered. How did a civilization with no iron, no steel, and no machinery as we understand it, cut and shape solid granite to a standard we struggle to reproduce with electricity? Today, we are going to follow the evidence carved into the stone itself. And the answer that keeps surfacing, the one that scientists have quietly circled for decades, is not a drill or a chisel. It is sound. Stay with me, because the part everyone argues about is not the part that should unsettle you. The unsettling part is the measurements. They are real, they are published, and nobody has explained them away. Let us start where the real Egyptologists started, because this is not a story invented for the internet. It begins with one of the most respected names in the entire history of the field. In the early 1880s, a young British surveyor named William Flinders Petrie went to Giza to do something almost no one had done properly before. He measured everything. Petrie was meticulous to the point of obsession. He is the man who essentially turned Egyptology from treasure hunting into a science. And while he was cataloging the debris around the pyramids, he collected a set of strange objects. Drill cores. When you bore a hole into stone with a hollow tube, you are left with a solid cylinder of rock in the middle, the piece the tube cut around. Those leftover cores survived, even though the tools that made them did not. Petrie gathered them, studied them, and then wrote down something that has haunted the field ever since. On one granite core, the one now cataloged as core number 7, he found a spiral groove running around the cylinder. That groove was the track left by the cutting edge as it sank into the stone, turn after turn. And by measuring the distance between one loop of the spiral and the next, Petrie could calculate how far the drill had driven into the granite with every single rotation. The number he arrived at was about 1/10 of an inch per revolution. Sit with that. 1/10 of an inch of solid granite removed with each turn of the tool. For comparison, a modern diamond-tipped drill, spinning thousands of times a minute, chews into granite at a small fraction of that rate. Petrie was looking at a Bronze Age object that appeared to have been cut faster than we can cut it now. He did not shout about aliens. He was far too careful for that. But even he admitted the tools that could produce this were, in his words, a mystery. The bits themselves were never recovered. Only the cores. Only the evidence. And here is the first detail that should make you uncomfortable. Granite is not one material. It is a chaotic mixture of crystals, mostly quartz and feldspar, jammed together, and those crystals have different hardnesses. When you drag an abrasive across granite, It should cut the softer feldspar faster and the harder quartz slower. The groove should wander. It should get shallow where it hits the tough quartz and deeper where it hits the soft parts. But that is not what the core shows. The groove on Petrie's core cuts straight through both the soft and the hard crystals at the same depth, as if the stone's own hardness did not matter to the tool at all. A pounding, grinding, abrasive process should be a slave to the hardness of whatever crystal it meets. This tool was not. It cut quartz and feldspar as though they were the same thing. That is not how sand and patience behave. That is how a fixed cutting point behaves when it is being driven with enormous, controlled force. For decades, scholars filed all of this under craftsmanship. Skilled hands, generations of practice, a lot of time. And craftsmanship is real. But craftsmanship does not explain the physics of that groove. It just puts a comforting word over the top of it. What it means is where the argument begins. And that is clue number 1. Hold on to it, because the second clue is the one that turns a strange object into a pattern nobody can dismiss. Before we get there, we have to deal with the ancient descriptions, because the Egyptians did leave us something, not a manual. They almost never explained their methods in writing, but they left images, symbols, repeated so often across temples and tombs that we tend to walk past them as decoration. And one of them, when you look at it with fresh eyes, stops looking decorative at all. Look at the objects the gods are shown holding. Over and over in Egyptian art, deities and kings grip a long, straight staff that ends in a distinctive forked shape at the bottom, like a two-pronged tail. It is called the scepter, and the textbooks tell us it is a symbol of power and dominion. Just an emblem, a sign of authority, nothing more. And maybe that is all it ever was. But notice the shape. A handle, a straight shaft, and a forked, two-teened end. If you handed that silhouette to an engineer with no context and asked what it resembled, a lot of them would give you the same answer. It looks like a tuning fork on a handle, a device for holding and directing vibration. For decades, scholars dismissed the scepter as pure symbolism, a picture of an idea. But symbols in Egypt were almost never arbitrary. They were pictures of real things. The ankh was a real object. The Jed pillar was a real object. And the forked scepter, held by the very figures associated with the power to shape the world, has a shape that mirrors the one tool a modern physicist would reach for if the goal were to apply a precise frequency to a fixed point. Not a myth, not a metaphor, possibly a picture of a tool drawn so many times that we stop seeing it. That is the reframe. And it points directly at the idea that has been sitting underneath this mystery the whole time. Not brute force, vibration. And to understand why that is not as crazy as it sounds, you have to understand what granite actually is. Because the stone the Egyptians kept choosing is one of the strangest materials on the planet to build with. The granite in these objects came, overwhelmingly, from one place, Aswan, more than 500 miles up the Nile from the great sites of the north. Think about the sheer effort in that choice. Egypt had soft, workable limestone everywhere, right under the builder's feet. Instead, for the objects that demanded the highest precision, they repeatedly went to enormous trouble to haul the single hardest, most difficult stone they could find across the entire length of the country. Rose granite from Aswan sits between 6 and 7 on the hardness scale, close enough to quartz that copper cannot touch it. And the reason that matters is what quartz does. Aswan granite is more than half quartz crystal, and quartz is not an ordinary mineral. When you squeeze it, vibrate it, or shock it, it produces an electrical charge. Squeeze it rhythmically, and it responds rhythmically. This is a real, measured, undisputed property of the stone. It is called the piezoelectric effect, and it is the exact reason there is a sliver of quartz keeping time inside a wristwatch right now. The Egyptians did not just work quartz-rich stone. They sought it out. They passed over easy stone to go and get the one material on Earth that turns vibration into energy and energy into vibration. Whether they knew what that stone could do is the heart of the entire question. But the choice is not in dispute. The most precise objects they ever made are carved from the most electrically and acoustically active natural material available to them. That is clue number 2. And it sets up the reveal that ties the whole thing together, the one that took the mystery out of a single museum drawer and spread it across a country. And that is where this stops being a debate about one drill core and becomes something much harder to wave away. Because so far, everything we have looked at could almost be argued down. A single spiral groove, a single measurement, but the same signature, the same impossible precision, the same fixation on the hardest stone in Egypt shows up again and again in objects that have nothing to do with each other except the standard to which they were made. What we are about to walk into is not one strange artifact. It is a pattern that runs from Giza to Saqqara to Aswan. And the more of it you see, the harder it becomes to believe you are looking at the work of copper and sand alone. Keep the drill core in your mind. You are about to see its twin, scaled up to 70 tons. Here is where it gets strange, because if this were only about drill cores, you could argue about them forever. A groove is a groove. Maybe Petrie miscounted. Maybe the spiral is a trick of the eye. But the Egyptians did not just drill holes. They made boxes. And the boxes are where the argument stops being an argument and starts being a problem. Beneath the sands of Saqqara, in a labyrinth of tunnels carved out of the bedrock, sits a place called the Serapeum. It was rediscovered in 1851 by the French archaeologist Auguste Mariette, who tunneled into a buried avenue and found himself in a dark underground corridor lined with side chambers. And inside those chambers were the boxes, more than 20 of them. Enormous containers carved from single blocks of granite and an even harder stone called diorite, each one the size of a small room. The numbers alone are staggering. Each box weighs somewhere between 70 and 100 tons. Each lid, a separate slab, weighs around 30 tons on its own. They were quarried at Aswan, over 500 miles away, hauled north, dragged down into these cramped underground tunnels, and slotted into recesses with barely room to walk around them. The official explanation is that they were coffins for sacred bulls, animals the Egyptians revered, and bulls were buried at the site. That much is documented. But the boxes themselves raise a question the bull story cannot answer. Why this stone? And why this precision? Because in the 1990s, an aerospace engineer named Christopher Dunn climbed inside one of them with the kind of tools his industry uses to check machined metal parts. And what he measured should not be possible in hand-carved stone. Dunn had spent his career in high-precision manufacturing. He knew exactly what a flat surface feels like because his whole profession depends on it. He pressed a precision straight edge, accurate to 2 10,000ths of an inch, against the inner walls of the granite boxes. And there was no gap, no light leaking under the edge. The interior surfaces were flat to within that tolerance, a standard we associate with granite surface plates used in modern machine shops to calibrate other tools. He came back years later with a precision square and checked the corners where the walls meet. Square, perpendicular to a resolution most workshops never need. The inside corners were cut to a radius of about 4 millimeters, tight enough that a pencil sits snugly in the join. There is no artistic reason to do that. A soft, rounded corner would look identical to the eye and be 100 times easier to make. That impossibly tight corner exists for one reason only, because the process that made it could hold that tolerance. Let me say plainly what that means, because it is easy to let the numbers slide past. These are multi-ton boxes, several feet across, carved from single blocks of the hardest stone in the region. And their inner surfaces are flat, square, and parallel to a standard that today requires precision ground equipment, temperature-controlled rooms, and diamond tooling. Dunn asked a modern granite firm whether they could reproduce one of these boxes from a single block. Their answer was that even with an unlimited budget and modern machinery, they would not attempt it in one piece. They would need 6 separate pieces bolted together. The Egyptians did it in one, and then they did it more than 20 times and left some of them unfinished, as if the workshop had simply been abandoned mid-project. Tools down and never restarted. Not similar to modern precision, not inspired by it. The same, measured, documented, and to this day, not explained. If this is the kind of buried evidence that keeps you up at night, subscribe and turn on the bell, because what these measurements point toward is the part they never put on the museum placard. So, how do you cut and shape granite to a machine shop tolerance without a machine? This is where the sound hypothesis stops being a fringe phrase and starts being an actual proposed mechanism. And it comes back to that quartz. The idea, argued most forcefully by Dunn and echoed by a growing line of researchers, is that the Egyptians were not overpowering the stone. They were resonating it. Every solid object has a natural frequency, a rate at which it wants to vibrate. Hit it at that frequency, and small inputs create large motions. Now, take a cutting tool, tip it with something hard, and drive it not with brute rotational force, but with high-frequency vibration, thousands of oscillations a second, ultrasonic, beyond what the human ear can hear. The tool no longer needs to be harder than the stone. It hammers the abrasive against the surface so fast and so precisely that the granite is broken down grain by grain. And crucially, it does not care whether the grain in front of it is soft feldspar or hard quartz. It shatters both at the same rate, which is exactly, precisely, the thing that Petrie's drill core showed, a cut that ignores the hardness of the crystal it meets. This is not science fiction hardware. We use it today. Ultrasonic machining is a real industrial process for cutting hard, brittle materials, and it works on exactly this principle. A vibrating tool, an abrasive slurry, and a frequency high enough that the material simply gives way. The claim is not that the Egyptians had our electronics. The claim is that they arrived at the same underlying physics by a different road, using a material, quartz, that generates and responds to those very vibrations, and forms, like that forked scepter, that could hold and direct them. Whether that specific reconstruction is right or not, notice what it does. It is the only proposed explanation that accounts for all three things at once: the impossible feed rate, the indifference to crystal hardness, and the obsessive choice of the one stone on Earth that turns pressure into vibration and back again. And it goes further than the boxes and the cores. There is an entire field now, archaeoacoustics, devoted to measuring the sound behavior of ancient stone structures. Researchers have gone into chambers across the ancient world with microphones and frequency analyzers, and found that many of them are acoustically tuned, built to resonate powerfully at specific low frequencies. Some right around the range of a deep male voice. Granite chambers that ring like the inside of an instrument. Rooms that amplify certain tones and swallow others. Stand in the right chamber, hum the right note, and you can feel the walls answer. The people who built these spaces were not deaf to what stone does with sound. They were, in structure after structure, building for it, positioning hard stone in confined spaces in ways that turn a room into a resonator. A civilization that tunes its rooms is a civilization that understands resonance. And a civilization that understands resonance is one step from turning it on a block of granite and using it as a tool. And remember what quartz-rich granite specifically does under that kind of vibration. This is the part that closes the loop. It is not just that granite carries sound well. It is that the quartz inside it is piezoelectric, meaning mechanical vibration and electrical charge in that stone are two sides of the same coin. Drive the crystal, and it answers electrically. Charge it, and it moves. That is a two-way door built into the very material they went 500 miles to collect. Most builders in history reached for the stone that was easiest to shape. The Egyptians, over and over, reached for the one stone whose internal physics links pressure, vibration, and electricity together in a single mineral. Maybe that was coincidence, a happy accident of taste and prestige. But it is a great deal of coincidence to stack in one place the hardest stone, the most acoustically active stone, the one mineral that turns a squeeze into a signal. All chosen deliberately, all hauled at ruinous expense, all worked to a standard that looks like the output of a process none of us can name. Now, here is where the story takes on the texture of every great unsolved mystery. Because the evidence does not sit in one convenient place where anyone can examine it. It is scattered, controlled, and strangely neglected. The drill cores sit in a museum drawer, studied by a handful of people over more than a century. The Serapeum boxes sit underground, and the precision measurements that made them famous were taken by an outside engineer, not by the institutions that control the site. And here is the detail that should stop you cold. In Dunn's own words, nobody has gone back to check. His measurements of those boxes, the flatness, the squareness, the 4mm corners, have never been formally replicated by mainstream archaeology, and they have never been refuted either. They simply sit there, unexamined, an open question that the field has largely chosen not to reopen. The most precise stone objects on the planet and the definitive study of their tolerances was done privately decades ago and left to gather dust. When work in the Serapeum stopped in antiquity, it stopped suddenly. Boxes left half-finished. And in a way, the investigation of them stopped suddenly too. Found, measured, and then set aside exactly as they were, waiting. Now, does any of this prove the most extreme version of the story? That the Egyptians had ultrasonic machine tools, a lost technology of sound erased from history? Probably not. Let us be honest about that, because the truth deserves better than hype. And this is the one place in this investigation where the doubt belongs. The mainstream explanation has real weight behind it, and it has a real champion. An experimental archaeologist named Denys Stocks spent decades doing something the theorists mostly did not. He actually tried to cut the stone. Stocks reconstructed over 200 ancient tools and put them to work, and he demonstrated, on camera and in careful experiments in Aswan, that you can cut granite with nothing more than a flat copper blade, a pile of quartz sand, and a lot of effort. The copper does not do the cutting. The sand does. The blade just drags the hard sand grains across the stone, and slowly a groove appears. He drilled granite the same way, with a copper tube and sand, and produced cores with striations on them. Stocks argued these methods explain the tool marks without any need for vibration, electricity, or lost technology. And his work matters because he did not just assert it, he showed it. There is more. When two researchers named Reed and Brownlee physically re-examined Petrie's infamous core number 7, they reported that the marks were not a single continuous spiral at all, but a series of separate rings. The ordinary result of a drill being lowered and raised. And to his enormous credit, when Christopher Dunn learned of that finding, he publicly suspended his own ultrasonic claim about that particular core, rather than cling to it. That is what honesty looks like. The spiral that started the whole modern debate may be less mysterious than it first appeared. So, no, this is not proof of ancient machines. I am not going to insult you by pretending it is. Strip away every wild theory, though, and here is what that grounded, skeptical view still cannot make ordinary. Stocks proved you can cut granite with sand. He did not prove you can hold it flat to 2/10,000ths of an inch across a 5-foot surface, square and parallel, on every wall, in a single block that a modern shop would only attempt in 6 pieces. Cutting is one thing. That tolerance is another thing entirely, and it is the thing that has never been replicated by hand. He proved the marks can be made. He did not close the gap between making a groove and machining a surface plate. The plain facts that remain, once you have thrown out the fantasy, are arguably stranger than the fantasy. A drill core cut at a rate we cannot match. A groove that ignores the hardness of the stone. More than 20 precision boxes carved from the hardest available material and abandoned mid-work. A tolerance measured once by an outsider and never checked again. And a civilization that chose, again and again, at enormous cost, the one stone that sings. You do not need aliens to be unsettled by that. You just need to look at what is actually there. And if even the modest version of this is true, it means something uncomfortable about the story we tell ourselves. It means a society we file under early antiquity possessed material knowledge and manufacturing standards that we are only now able to measure, and in places still cannot reproduce. It means the picture we have of how these objects were made is not a finished portrait. It is a sketch, with the most important lines left blank. Because here is the question that will not let go. If they did this with sound, with a mastery of vibration and resonance advanced enough to shape the hardest stone on Earth to the tolerance of a modern machine, then where did that knowledge go? Skills like that are not casually forgotten. They are taught, refined, and passed down for generations. And then, at some point, the tools vanish. The method disappears. And all that survives is the stone and a forked symbol nobody can read anymore. A civilization does not lose a technology that powerful by accident. So either it was never written down, guarded, and kept inside a closed circle of makers until that circle broke, or it was written down, and we have simply never found the page. Either way, the capability was real, and then it was gone. And the objects it made are still sitting there, flat and square and silent, holding a tolerance that outlived the people who achieved it. Think about what that means for everything we have not measured yet. The drill cores were sitting in a drawer for a century before anyone did the math on that spiral. The boxes waited underground until one engineer thought to bring a straight edge. How many more objects are in storerooms and site museums across Egypt right now, unmeasured, uncatalogued to that level of detail, quietly recording a manufacturing standard nobody has looked for? The tools that made them may never turn up, but the physics is written into the stone, in the depth of a groove and the flatness of a wall, waiting for someone to read it. And the deeper we look with better instruments, the same thing keeps happening that happened with the drill core and the boxes. It does not get simpler. It gets stranger. Here is the one question that will outlast this video. If the people who shaped these boxes truly understood how to turn vibration into a cutting force, precise enough to leave a corner a pencil fits into, then the tool that did it was not a hammer or a chisel or a copper saw. It was closer to a sound, and whatever that sound was, the exact frequency, the exact method, the exact hand that drove it, is gone. What remains is the echo of it, frozen in granite, in a museum drawer in London, and a dark tunnel under the desert. The core is still there. Its spiral still cut faster than we can cut it. The boxes are still there, still flat, still square, still waiting for someone to go back and check what one engineer found, and no institution has been willing to confirm or deny. The tool is missing. The method is missing. The knowledge is missing. And the stone that they made is sitting exactly where they left it, saying nothing and everything at the same time.